Hi, thank you very much, Tim. Appreciate it. Blake Gilson, Industrial Cybersecurity Operations Manager at ExxonMobil. Our journey for this particular talk, we want to focus on the security operations functions of enabling the investigations and security operations aspects for the industrial processes. Want to talk about that journey and that journey related to scale and the challenges of scaling those across multiple industries at more or less the same time in progress. ExxonMobil, of course, participates in a large collection of different industries that are related about managing the molecules around the petrochemicals, but they're very discrete and very independent. So when we talk about IT-OT convergence, I look at that in two ways. There is a story around introduction of IT technologies into the process control space that's played out over the last 20 years that isn't really interesting or new. But then there's also the component of the IT departments and companies trying to figure out what their role is in the new world of those solutions existing and how they can provide and add business value and services to the space. This, of course, is playing out on a questioning how system administrations are done. How do we look at scale and capabilities to be able to optimize the administration of these systems? But then, of course, why we're here, that cybersecurity related components and risks that is changing within the threat landscape, but also in the environment itself. There's a third related transformation happening within industry and at ExxonMobil, which I more or less term the OT convergence, is where we're collaborating and working and building solutions across various product and capabilities, where we're taking engineering functions for discrete and focused industries and trying to bring them together, develop cross-industry capabilities, and be able to progress engineering at a larger corporate scale where you may have downstream specific instrumentation and control people working on upstream projects, and that collaboration between them is unlocking potential business value thereof. We in the cybersecurity community and IT need to contain the connection between those different verticals and optimizations. And as that control system continues to evolve, as we look at governing practices and leveraging the scale, that we can be a part of that journey and transformation thereof. It positions us really, really well to be able to make sure that we can progress the cybersecurity journey holistically, but also respect that every particular industry is in their own journey. So then our cybersecurity strategy looks at not just what is the company doing, but how can I progress that particular business unit within the context of their industry and moving that forward. The tank terminals business, where the big trucks go up before they take it to retail, is a completely different business than deep water oil and gas exploration. But what are those common things that link us together? And security operations from an ICS perspective is just one of those elements. But one thing that we always want to focus and draw attention to is that balance between meeting cybersecurity objectives and protecting business value. That the core reason we're here is to enable and ensure that that business value is preserved, that the mission in the OPSEC of the organization can be met, so we can get our products consistently and reliable to our customers that need it, and that we are in a unique position to easily destroy business value through misguided directions and policies from a global risk and compliance management perspective, but focusing on those activities that provide that return for security and investment, and balancing what we want to accomplish here from a cybersecurity perspective, and also unlocking potential value in enabling it. Great discussions yesterday about we can't be no, we have to be yes and focusing that and keeping that balance is absolutely key, and the security operations is one of those key areas. Part of our security program, just a subsection of that, broken down to 4 areas: protecting that perimeter. The history of that perimeter of the ICS environment and separating those domains between it. Our company has been a historical leader in this approach and baking this into our core design principles. The enabling of the visibility and monitoring those lessons that we should have learned from some of the early incidents is a growth area, is an expansion to do such. But that said, there's always something we can continue to do to harden that perimeter of that ICS and make sure you don't draw that perimeter perimeter too closely, where you think of that perimeter of the ICS is just your enterprise process control environment. That is not the case. The threat vectors also mentioned in other speakers are real. The USBs, the external network connections, is that overwhelming tendency to connect your system to the internet to just download that patch that'll help that operations member perform it, are all aspects of that perimeter defenses that it is. Working my time at ExxonMobil, we've always had a project to continue to harden and define that perimeter, now matching it not just as a perimeter that we have big walls, but putting sentries on those walls and gaining that visibility to what happens when it's eventually breached, someone digs underneath, someone comes over top. That's the key focus of being able to drive protection and detection visibilities at that same component, enabling monitoring of key data and then investigating in partnership with operations. It's that once those events take place, those where relationships are tested, where requests are made to site and field engineers, and having that partnership will enable the future kind of operations. So when we designed this particular program and the corresponding organizations that enabled it, we looked at the workflows that drove our security operations functions on IT and compared it to the data and underlying sources that were going to drive the OT security operations, and concluded that the right answer, which I think many organizations, is these were too diverse to try to bring it into one organization. The knowledge problem and the respect for operations integrity that comes as a component of performing cybersecurity services inside the ICS warrants a organizational separation, but not just for the respect for what makes ICS unique, but also for the respect that makes IT unique, is that what you do from a day in and how those workflows are driven, that adding additional work objectives to their plate could degrade or risk their core functions of providing those services for the enterprise. So given that, we focused the organization a little bit differently and created those two independent groups, one focusing on the risk for OT cybersecurity risk management, and then another one focused on IT systems. This allowed us to be able to have those two separate policies and procedures and then drive strategies consistent throughout. And then that close linkage of security operations from a SOC perspective and projects to enable visibility could be progressed out of one group, so you have something to work on while you're gaining those logs and visibility and progress that multi-year strategy. So that's how we answer the organizational question on how to best position these new services that we're looking to deploy within the company. That said, what were the foundational data components of that journey to be able to expand and gain visibility? From an endpoint protection, we wanted endpoint detection and response-like capability without using those tools. So there's a continued opportunity and a lot of research focused on. We understand the obsolescence problems of those environments. We understand we will have to run systems for way longer than the manufacturer of the software components would have expected us to run, but we need to be able to harvest the appropriate amount of data off of that to get to that like capability that we have that drives the workflows on the IT side. We're not done here on this journey, and I think we as an industry have more work to do to be able to gain those systems. As we all know, there's a significant Windows component and operating components of these ICS environments, and there's more we can and need to do to be able to progress the appropriate visibility. This is, of course, where network detection plays a significant component, because if you can catch the C2 communications there, then you didn't necessarily need to catch it on those Windows operating systems. But scaling these solutions can be very challenging across where we have a huge information gap between what the SOC team knows and what the environment knows. Progressing this as an iterative approach has been our strategy, enabling the network security monitoring at boundary points, and then inside the network starting at zone boundaries where communications between systems are the focus, and then getting to that east-west traffic when you're in a particular control system thereof. And some of the case studies that I'll mention in just a bit kind of illustrate where those can be deployed to maximum success. And then everything else, kind of the kitchen sink of other things that you want to be able to detect. The ultimate mission of being able to take data streaming off of the systems, comparing it to change management work order systems to get that delta, to detect living off the land, is one of our ultimate objectives, that we have the data out there. We have a work management processes. We have streaming data coming off of the equipment. Can we marry those two together and provide it? Right, eventually. Eventually we'll be able to get all of that siloed data in together, but it's of course something we progress over it. Oh, so I selected 3 interesting cases. These are all based on real stories, but enough facts have been changed to make them not material. All these stories aren't actually originating from ExxonMobil, but they were they brought a different perspective into some of the early items that the security operations and investigation functions progressed, that wasn't your traditional, okay, find the persistence and kick it out. Kind of like, what were we tested originally as we created this service? Because the service was twofold. It was facilities, sites, engineers, operations, call us if you have a potential cybersecurity component as a part of teaching operations to function, and operations to be able to learn about cybersecurity, kind of with the previous presenters, making sure that your operator knows that. We want to be able to say, if you have challenges, you can give us a call, while we were driving the visibility expansion program that's still ongoing. So the ultimate objective is that you get a phone call from a system and an environment streaming in telemetry that you have to action on. But at the same time, there's many environments where you have no visibility, so you have to be able to prepare to an environment that you have no preparation in, you have no logs on there, and you'll work with operations and be able to provide that value in resiliency. So this particular scenario was one where no member of the SOC team knew anything about this particular subsection of this plant. And then, of course, we're asked to perform incident response. That ultimate objective that one day we will get to getting a phone call for an environment where we have that log and visibility is that objective, which at this point in time, we weren't there yet. Okay, scenario. An unexpected trip happens. Unexpected trips happen all the time, right? All right. And in the process of understanding and applying engineering to understand why these trips could occur is normal. It's operations performs this function regularly, and the process they use to diagnose it is quite commonplace. But in this particular instance, we got a phone call asking our assistants to remove cyber from the table on an unexpected trip of a gas turbine generator that they couldn't explain. The amount of investment we had to put in to our program to even get to that level, I think is incredible, is to be able to inspire that operations member to think about cyber. There's a commentary where, well, they're going to take the easy way out. We shouldn't overemphasize this. We can't play it up too big because they're going to call us all the time. They're always going to think every operational anomaly is a cyber component. That's not true. These individuals and their engineering background, it irritates them when they can't explain it. They're going to explain, at least we found, the vast majority of the hard process-related upsets are explainable through their existing processes. But the parts that they can't, we want them to consider cyber. And then when they do ask the cyber group to get involved to assist, that person is rewarded beyond recognition. Email the plant manager, good cybersecurity behaviors, right? That recognition and appreciation for what that is, regardless of the outcome of that investigation. I think it's a boogeyman where we're like, we can't overblow this a particular scenario, that we can trust our operations folks to make that related component. Okay, regardless, we're called in to assess see if we can generate a reason for why the trip occurred on the environment and try to rule out cyber. So we have kind of a quick background, the system generates electricity, electrical substations and equipment in there help manage that electricity and system. This is provided back to a utility, and there's a connection to provide information and data about the performance of the system and what's expected with a third party. So that's that bottom set of the components. The team gets involved and starts from no information, starts to figure out, is everything on the subsystem networks is expected? Is there something there that is unexpected, that's unaccounted for? So this is an environment with no with no Windows domain, right? Nothing, that type of components. And so we're writing PowerShell scripts, we're loading them onto Windows laptops, we're scanning the network to try to validate, getting back MAC addresses to try to prove, okay, this is what we're expecting. A cell modem didn't slip in here for an unexpected reason, or that we had a good grasp of the architecture overall. Of course, operations was able to provide a set of diagrams and drawing with the appropriate explanations behind it, but we have a requirement within the company that any system that's connected to a third party needs to go through an above-site headquarters review, and documentation about that particular connection needs to be recorded and approved, essentially, that meets that minimum standards. This environment had that because the external connection at the bottom between this system and the operator of the electrical utility that is the recipient for some of the power and electricity. That documentation and the annotations on that documentation about how the system worked far exceeded what operations was able to provide from just a process documentation, because it was written by a cybersecurity professional in the language that we could understand. Pictures of firewall rules, descriptions of how the systems were communicated. That pre-assessment around external network connectivity was a huge advantage when we started investigating this, because it was already written in a language that we could understand. No anomalous devices found on that network. Logs are being extracted off of the particular relays and controllers that control it to try to figure out what could be a potential cause. Program uploads or firmware updates seem to be erroneously installed at various systems, and of course that part of those firmware upgrades, these controllers were resetting, and it appears that these unexplained program uploads and firmware adjustments weren't consistent with what was expected at that time. So of course this furthered the concern around a potential cyber incident, especially with the network connection. To get that to that conclusion that I just described was days of work, including about how to most effectively extract the logs. Vendors were engaged on the relays, explaining what their capabilities are, and then particularly the automation controller there that forms, which is a multi-purpose device that allows for that communication. Understanding how it is and how it functions required a lot of third parties to be able to provide us advice and guidance, because we found that operations was able to articulate the function, what it's doing within the system, but what could it do, right? That's the hardest piece to pull out of it. In this particular instance, this automation controller is actually running Linux underneath, so it could do a lot of things, right? It could be significantly different from what could be the cause of the particular connections. The equipment that we were pulling logs off of, the logs were very difficult to analyze. It's not something we use all the timelining skills, right, that you can learn in the same classes to pull them together. But what particular items did was heavily reliant on those vendors. And then we were able to extract the firmware version that was being attempted to be uploaded to various systems, and then we had to provide that to the vendor, and that is your hold your breath moment, right? Like, please let's make sure they can say that this is their software, because if it's not, then someone's going to SANS is going to write an article about this. Luckily it was, but the other major component that the vendor manufacturer was able to provide us is they could tell us who at our company had downloaded that software, which was a boon for focusing the investigation on that in the right direction, because you have to credential and authenticate, of course, before you access it to be able to download it. And then you just search by email address. You then can figure out those kind of human interactions to be able to progress the investigation further. And then lastly, that particular firewall, the time progressed, let's ensure the integrity of that firewall. With dispatch people in the field to pull that configuration, and sure enough, it was configured. It had rules on it, but it was left in test mode, so they were not operational. And so you can see the building up over time, we're getting very concerned about what potentially could be here, and it became a focus on removing cyber from the capability and progress. Through that and partnership with the physical security team, we're able to narrow the timeline to identify the individuals. The cybersecurity team, of course, had to work through plant management to be able to communicate and get information off. This is also a unionized component. During a turnaround, a lot of activity, a lot of footage to review, and that line pushes us very closely to where are we progressing cybersecurity concerns and where are we managing an HR case, right? And that line and distinction is it's something you don't probably drill appropriately, and something we hadn't necessarily considered how we were going to process this as a young team, and how were we going to keep focused on progressing the technical investigation forward throughout. Then we were able to go from there to the prescribed maintenance laptops used to push the software, and then we had a dead box forensics experiment, right? Can we demonstrate that this software and firmware was on those systems or used on the laptops that we could? So this is full disk imaging, trying to perform that remote, working with operations to perform that, get those files back, using all of our digital forensics and incident response build, finding the firmware within memory. We now have a likely cause. No other indicators of compromise, but the true story of why this event occurred, almost becomes irrelevant. And I don't know the extent of the story, because we were able to remove it, and then the management and operations of change component of this, and what happened to that particular individual. Was he at one substation, mistyped an IP address, programming the wrong one? Those parts can be handed back and managed by operation. But this story illustrates what we had to do pre-monitoring, right? So getting to that ultimate conclusion of removing the cyber component of it was the value we provided, was the analysis and assessment that we could, but it also provided a good example of what we needed to do in the future for managing like systems. This, of course, is where network security monitoring, asset verification can be a part of that program, but also looking at being able to get to conclusions faster. What I just described in the course of events spanned weeks. Be able to progress one at a time, getting someone out to pull the logs of this particular system, setting up a meeting with the vendor to be able to progress. And even when you're working just an unexpected trip case, you could lose management attention. They're performing other functions. During this one was during a turnaround. There's 100 other work objectives before, and how delicate do we need to do to push this where in relationship to the other priorities of operations. So being able to get to a state where that firewall there isn't just a device that you have to go to physically interact with, but one that streams that data off of it. One that we can do configuration assurance remotely and then transform the network. In this particular instance, the time was set perfectly across all of the control equipment, but the configurations on the manageable networking devices were probably like nothing, right? No logging set up, the wrong firmware versions to enable logging capability, no time set. And this is a ripe opportunity that if we would have constructed this with cyber in mind, those would become data points that we can put out. And then this is also an area where that east-west network monitoring traffic just excels, because this is such a predictable type of communication item. It's not like you're putting an IDS in the middle of a busy L3 DMZ Windows domain. We could get that components out of that also, and bring that into our system and overall. So The core story around this was managing the security operations and human side of the investigation is a major component for us to be able to understand how we can better interact with these teams and then also make our drills better overall. All right, so that was the first case study. The second one is a story about USBs. USBs and maintenance laptops. We spend a lot of time focusing on DCS oriented architecture. One you may see in 410, where you have the set of systems that run your operations. You have that demarcation between the enterprise network. You have your control environment, your DCS, your particular control drone that performs various functions, but there's always something extra. There's something that doesn't fit well into the component. We call these subsystems, systems that have very discrete focused processes that perform some type of monitoring function or potentially even a control function that is bought as a separate kit that is added on to the control system in itself. With so much attention focused on that main control system, these systems can be ripe for missing it. It could, this particular instance of machinery type analytical system that does have a connection back to some of the DCS, but it's for gathering information for mechanical integrity in systems. And these package systems come with computers, come with laptops, comes with systems that, because they're not treated like engineering workstations as a part of the core process, may not get the same rigor and focus from where your components are. And then you have a lot of these systems, one turns up with malware. Where did it come from? How could it shown up on that system? Where could it be elsewhere in the environment? All of those questions arise. So the criticality of this particular package system is very low, but knowing that it was relative in the vicinity of very important systems, then asks a different question: how far did this go? Then working and progressing this case, we looked, of course, to the malware, derived indicators of compromise. Then the search was on, can we demonstrate that this USB that also had evidence of remnants of the malware, or this system that we were being assured would be only used for these purposes, wasn't used for something else? And then we now go through the process of hunting with real indicators of compromise through the rest of it. And this is where that hunt process will look very different based on the architecture of your system. And so if your DMZ zone is centrally monitored, if you have next generation monitoring and capabilities in that, it would look very, very different than your DCS system that you bought 15 years ago that is stuck in the past, and all your scription and detections will then have to be rewritten in PowerShell 1 because you need a totally different maintenance operational strategy to be able to hunt for those operators at scale. Just what I've just described there is, again, weeks of work. Being able to be able to get the particular malware sample, generate the indicators, to be able to progress it, make sure it will run on that DCS environment, and then you also go through everything else. In this particular scenario, the kind of advice we would provide anyone facing this is, how far do you go? When is it good enough? And you should pre-discuss with operators, plant management, and your management about, if this particular event happened, we of course wouldn't stop operations. We have no reason to believe that operations would do it, but we could spend an exorbitant amount of time reviewing and making sure for all confidence that what we were described as the way these USBs and laptops were used, that is true. This is where scripting, detections, and that capability as cybersecurity professionals and system administrators excel, because we can help operations do that more effectively. But you need those relationships where they trust you, where they say, don't worry, I know this is the DCS environment that runs the facility, but running this particular thing so we can gather this X amount of information on it to hunt for these particular indicators won't hurt your system. And having that trust and resiliency to be complete in that investigation is something you form beforehand. And then the work required to enable that and structure that will be correlated. What we found is that, what is the risk? of the malware and the derivative and nature of that malware that's been discovered, that using that as a to drive how deep you go has been our historical answer. But we want to avoid losing face and reinfections on systems that if if our process of evaluating it isn't thorough enough to ensure the operational integrity of components. The other story and narrative around this particular instance is highlighting those threat vectors again. Where there's so much attention and focus on the L3, L4 firewall, ensuring that protection, be willing to segment it. But what about how do you feed data into the facility? If you don't have a good process for even discrete systems on how you deliver the needed files and data required for continuing to operate that system in that environment, the business will figure out a way. It could be with USBs. It could be with connecting to untrusted networks. Figuring out what that is and how that works for your company will prevent this particular threat vector from materializing. Was the source a third-party laptop, a USB that we were provided by a vendor? Was it picked up when it was connected to the guest internet access to develop file retrievals? There may or may not be enough forensics there to be able to conclude that for sure, but at least we were able to say that we have the contained around that particular instance, and that analysis and assessment we could assist. And okay, so that was the second case study there. The third one I wanted to talk about, which was interesting, was oriented around drilling operations. Drilling operations is interesting because there is, in order to perform the business function of drilling, it's a collaboration of multiple companies that have to come together to perform a service. So it's heavily relied on service performers, and 30 companies come together to help drill that well. The major players, of course, is the customer, the oil company that commissions the rig, but also the rig owner itself, a different company, and then all the supporting third-party companies between that. In this particular instance, a service contractor was commissioned to provide a SaaS offering for advanced analytics on data streaming off of it. So, of course, SaaS applications, we have IT processes and components that would allow us to be able to manage that system, understand the risk of the data, but that data has to come from somewhere. There was a kit installed on the facility that interconnected with other systems that needed to stream that data live back. Understanding about how the telecom communications vendor from the VSAT provider that is commissioned by the rig owner interacts and delivers the requirement and connectivity for the third party that's providing the SaaS application, and how those companies interact could definitely shape the risk profile within these systems. And of course, if this is designed poorly, you can easily see where this could go. We have systems on the internet that shouldn't be exposed in the manner and configured that they are. Did it meet the business purposes? Yes. But could you easily find yourself in a situation where RDP is exposed, right, for remote support that enables remote support, but then also you have a piece of your system that is designed in a manner that we had no control and oversight. And the push for IoT in this instance and SaaS, and then the connections to the physical process and the things, how those come together, and then how it's governed becomes an extra layer of complexity. It's such that two interactions of third parties can introduce risks to your operations, but these aren't even our systems or computers. So that playing on that boundary and understanding it from your company's perspective, how far do we go? If a third-party vendor shows up with a laptop and system that is infected on your facility, of course you can quarantine, manage, control that, and perform infection, but would you perform incident response on it? Even if it was used within your system, they could provide risk. That demarcation of where do you prescribe security standards, where the contractor has a cybersecurity concern that impacts operations, and how that plays out in your larger strategy for communication and response is a line that's very blurry, that's very difficult and working in progress. So prescribing those standards, those focuses, and getting the right conversations to happen pre-deployment is the message here. And we push for a broader, holistic view. If anything could risk operations, we have to be able to understand how it is, regardless of who ultimately owns that box and how the agreements between those companies open and operate. Adapting digital incidents and forensics response into this third-party oriented environment is the challenge here, and will continue to be a challenge as we look to optimize our business processes and leverage third parties to their maximum effect. That said, thank you so much. Really appreciate SANS for having the opportunity to talk about real cases, and hopefully there were some twists on particular situations that would drive conversations at your company to see how you can adapt this and move this forward. Those core skills we're learning here is key, but progressing it in the real world creates an additional different set of skills and requirements, and really appreciate you coming in to my talk. So thank you.